Hello, welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. Microsoft is the sponsor of our podcasts and live streams from the OpenSource Summit in Los Angeles, California. Learn more about app service on Linux and Microsoft's journey as they continue their road to adopting and embracing open source technologies. Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack here at the Open Source Summit in Los Angeles, California, where I am joined with Arun Chandrasekhar.
Hi.
How are you?
Yeah, pretty good.
Great. And we're going to talk about hybrid multi-cloud strategies with Azure OSS. And I know you're talking about that today. And I'm just curious, if just to get started, can you tell us, why is this important? Why is hybrid multi-cloud becoming such an important concept?
Yeah, typically you see a lot of focus in conferences on the bleeding edge. So you have things like microservices and the next step around containerization. However, if you look at the majority of enterprises and customers today, they're in the continuum where they're still struggling with how do I get my apps into the cloud. So that's where hybrid multi-cloud strategies become very critical, right? It's about how do you get your existing assets, or how do you very quickly switch over to the cloud. And that's why we have things like Jenkins and Terraform and other open source tools that help you do that integration. That's kind of the core focus of my topic tomorrow. Okay, and so I think one of the promise we saw with containers, right, is that you could use the tools that you've become accustomed to using. And so this follows that concept to some degree, doesn't it? Yes, I think the key benefit is that you try to use the tools that you're already familiar with and that you know and love, rather than go after learning a whole new tool set. So it's basically, with Azure, we try to meet you where you are, rather than start building things, rebuilding things from scratch. Right. So how do you enable this hybrid with Azure OSS integrations? So hybrid specifically is about, we have taken the tools, the most mainstream, most popular tools. So for example, you have Jenkins, which is the most popular continuous integration tool out there. We took that and we said, okay, let's ensure that every single Jenkins user who's using an on-premise Jenkins master can now build and do his continuous integration with Azure resources. So we have a whole bunch of integrations with Azure container instances, Kubernetes, as well as virtual machines. So you can now do, sort of leverage the elastic scale of the cloud, but stay comfortably in your Jenkins masters without needing to start lifting and shifting that to the cloud. Right? So they can use Jenkins, Terraform, and Ansible to work across on-premise, private cloud, as well as third parties such as Cloudflare, PagerDuty, on and on. Yes, so that's another interesting thing is with Terraform, you can also start going hybrid to the next level, where you not only use Terraform to provision on-premise resources, you use it to provision Azure resources as well as third-party resources. So you can sort of have this mix where hybrid is not just about private public cloud, it's about private, public, and third-party providers. I see. So that's the extension of that kind of hybrid definition in many ways. I think that makes sense because we are also increasingly seeing services come out of those different open source projects. Yep. That have their own capabilities and features. Exactly. We have things which are very specialized and do one thing and do it really well. We have things like for DNS, we have things for security. So a lot of people want to mix and match in the OSS space, where they can say, okay, I'll use Azure for my public cloud, but then I'll use a set of these along with the Azure. So it's not about you're limited to staying within the Azure boundary. You can step out and do a little bit of a mix and match. So one of the things that it seems like then you can do is you can enable this, for example, Jenkins support
where the master can be on premise while the dev test workloads
Can be in the cloud.
can be deployed on Azure.
Exactly.
Okay, great.
That's the scenario I talked about with the build and the continuous integration, right?
Okay. So then what about multi-cloud? What does that mean then?
Yeah. So multi-cloud is a little bit of a pivot on the theme of, okay, I have my traditional data center, but I also want to be able to use the big three like cloud providers like Azure, AWS, and Google. So how do I sort of hedge my bets? So I want to ensure that I want to have this platform that I use a single kind of tool set and a single kind of language that works across all of these. And this is where the HashiCorp tool suite really comes together, where they have things such as Terraform, which is basically, if you're familiar with AWS, it's the CloudFormation template, or if you're familiar with Azure, it's the Azure Resource Manager template. There is a sort of multi-cloud template that Terraform has, which you can now use to provision across all these resources. And again, this lets you have a multi-cloud strategy to build your own application platforms and bring your own third-party providers into the mix with the kind of support that we have. So one of the things that we are doing is we are entered into a sort of a multi-year partnership with HashiCorp to ensure that every single Azure resource that you need can be provisioned using Terraform. So that's kind of one of our key focus areas in the open source integration space.
So again, so the way that you guys look at it is that you can use tools such as Terraform and Vault to work across the different major cloud services,
Yep.
Azure, Google, and Amazon. So what you're doing is you're enabling those customers to have this tighter Terraform integration with Azure.
Exactly.
Huh. Okay. So so you guys really like Terraform. What is it that you like so much about it?
So there are two aspects to it. One is the language. The HashiCorp configuration language is a nice sort of pivot on top of the sort of verbose JSON that you normally write to provision things. And the second aspect of it is what I mentioned with the multi-cloud support, but it's also the original definition of hybrid that I talked about, where they support like over 30 providers. So you can not only use it for things like the big three cloud providers, you can also use it with OpenStack, with VMware if you want to use it on-premise, or you can also mix it with Cloudflare, Simple DNS, PagerDuty, and so on. So it gives you that sort of flexibility.
So you can use Terraform with Azure really to build that out the core infrastructure such as VMs, networking, and storage. I'm curious of that part of it because that speaks to the maturity of the ecosystem, doesn't it?
Yes. So I mean, today what that means is like with Terraform, you can now start building out core infrastructure like virtual machines, network, and so on in a similar way across all the three different cloud providers. And the idea there is like you're literally terraforming. You know, the term terraform comes from like if I want to make Mars look like Earth. So effectively, you want to make your cloud look like your traditional data center, and that's where Azure comes in with any resource that you want. You can kind of start building it to make it look like what you have in your on-premise data center.
So how does the app service on Linux offer relate to all this? Like what's the corollary there?
Yeah, so app service on Linux is something that we made generally available last week. We announced this, and we have a keynote later today that also goes into that. So the idea behind app service is effectively it's a platform as a service offering where you can now use something that is again familiar in terms of all your OSS tools. Like we say, okay, from Jenkins you can now go and deploy web apps to app service. From Terraform, you can now provision an app service sort of provider. Now, the idea is not just that we have tools like that. It's like just use Docker and use like the language that you want, like Node or something, and build a containerized app. You don't have to worry about figuring out how to make that app scale in a containerized world. So it's effectively completely abstracting away the problem of building out schedulers, like using Kubernetes or anything else. It just says, okay, I'm an app developer. I'll write my Node app. I'll containerize it and push it to the cloud, and it'll just work. And that's why the app service on Linux containers is extremely compelling for developers who don't want to get into the ops space at all, right? So that's a nice.
But there's a good CICD story there.
Oh yeah, I mean all the tools that you have, like Jenkins, and we also have integrations coming up with Ansible, and any CI/CD tool that you have, because you can use Azure CLI and Azure SDKs to go and integrate and deploy to app service really nicely. So that's kind of a nice.
It seems like such a change compared to a few years ago. Someone was talking to me about when I was kind of relating a conversation I had with Solomon Hykes, it was back in 2013, and this was at the OSCON in Portland, and we're sitting down, and he's showing me this matrix of hell, right? Which basically he was just saying, it's just very complicated to keep everything updated all the time. Now we are, but that was so early, right,
Yep.
in the market, but now we actually have the need for that. And this seems to represent that, right?
Yes.
You can run. What you're trying to do is create almost like this matrix of simplicity in
Yes.
many ways.
Exactly. I mean, it's sort of like you're trying to hide all the plumbing. There's this book by Nicholas Carr called The Big Switch that he wrote in 2008. It's about hiding all the nasty plumbing under the covers so the developer can just focus on what he does best, which is developing the code and then just making it, and then we try to take care of everything else for you. There are some there are very simple versions of this, like functions and serverless, but this is something where a developer is doing serious enterprise-grade applications where you want a broader set of infrastructure that you want to run on. You just don't want to say, okay, I'll write a function and throw it out there, right? You want to be able to do something a little bit more, and that's where the app service becomes really compelling.
So tell me a little bit more about Jenkins integration with Azure.
So with Jenkins, we've done some really deep investments over the past year. As an aside, Jenkins itself runs on Azure. So if you look at the Jenkins OSS community, every single check-in that they do is actually committed into and built using all the agents and plugins that we have for continuous integration. What we've done is we've taken the last few months and focused primarily on the container aspect of it. We already have VM agent support, so now we have the container agent support. So now you can use containerized agents to do your builds in Jenkins. And one of the key features that we are leveraging here is something called Azure Container Instance, which is again a service that's saying that you just give me a container and don't worry about the scheduler, and we will take care of it for you. And it's a perfect auto-scaling system that helps you scale any build that you want. So not worry about how do I scale this build. Jenkins will just interact with the Azure Container Instance, and it's cheap because you're not using all of the compute. You're just being built for the actual compute that is used by those containers. Right? So that's kind of a nice.
So Jenkins though is pretty, it's pretty mature.
Yes.
And so are these integrations really necessary to bring it into this new realm that so many developers are experiencing now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's like it's the same theme that I originally started with, where you really want to meet developers where they are, and Jenkins is over 70% of continuous integration usage in the market, right? So there are a lot of Java developers and a lot of developers having this Jenkins builds and CI, and this is the simplest and first baby step that they can take into the cloud. So it's not because it's so mature and they have this confidence that it'll just work. So if somebody wants to do this, they don't have to lift and shift everything into the cloud. They just do this lightweight, well, let me use it for my dev test workloads first and see how it goes. So that's where we are trying to really make that the core focus.
So with all this configuration management does not go away, right? So what about it, and what OSS do you support on Azure for that?
Yeah, so like configuration management is not going away, but it's getting much simpler. So what we do is obviously we have invested and partnered with Chef and Puppet, so we support config as code for years. So you can always take all your Chef and Puppet workloads and use it with Azure. However, we're also seeing this trend where with containerization and immutable pipelines, there are more modern infrastructures like Spinnaker from Netflix, for instance, that we integrate with quite deeply. And then we also have Ansible seems to play really nicely in this space because it's very lightweight, stateless, and do very simple config management. We released in Ansible Fest last week, we released over 15 modules to address the integration of Ansible to Azure as well. So these are sort of so you can use any tool you want, but these are the ones where we've actually gone and done some extra work to make sure that it's native and you have a nice paved road to Azure from these tools.
So what about the developer who wants to try out some of these integrations? What should they do?
So firstly, we started building these hubs in docs.microsoft.com. For instance, if you go to docs.microsoft.com, you can get into the Jenkins hub, where you'll be able to see all the different integrations that I talked about today and how to leverage them. Secondly, you also have a new Slack channel that I'm announcing, which is basically called azurecommons.slack.com, where what we're doing is we're getting all the partners like Jenkins and HashiCorp and everybody, as well as customers, to interact with each other to sort of figure out how this works and how to make the sort of journey into the cloud happen. And then we have the Azure team and our team sort of sitting there and helping out to ensure that they get the right set of guidance and to make them move into the cloud. And we're also going to publish a whole bunch of reference architectures and guidance that'll sort of make it much simpler for folk who are not really familiar with the cloud. They're not building cloud native apps. They're new to the cloud and they want to do the shift using hybrid strategies. Right?
So you must be investing quite a bit into documentation then.
Oh, absolutely. So that is one of our key focus areas, is to really help guide customers, not just on the services that we provide, but on how the open source tools integrate with these services. And that is probably the number one priority for us in terms of all these things. Because the tools can be there, but then if you don't have the guidance, then customers are going to be lost.
Yeah, it seems with this new, matrix, so to speak, that you really need to have this documentation. Because there's multiple operating systems that you're working with, right? There are different cloud services that you're working with. There's all kinds of different patterns and complexities that you have to be considering.
Absolutely. I think the what we're thinking of, think of it as a sort of a set of Lego blocks, but then there's no model, there's no handbook of how do you use these Lego blocks together.
Right.
And that's where we come in. I mean, we want to make sure that we have very clear patterns and practices that we have evolved over the years working with enterprises. We just want to make sure that we follow the same kind of rigor when it comes to building in the cloud, and not just having this cacophony of tools that you want to go and integrate with. Say, okay, these are these patterns. There's an immutable pattern. There is a pattern using config as code. There's a pattern using infrastructure as code. How do you use these to leverage the right OSS tool for the job?
So where do we go from here? What's next then for you guys?
I think a whole bunch of the integrations that we're talking about are with Azure services that we have today. But then there is a whole set of exciting Azure services that we are working on that I cannot talk about,
right.
But which when we think of it as the big switch that we talked about with Nicholas Carr, when he hid the plumbing, is actually a series of small switches, right? It happened with containers, it happened with microservices, but then there's a whole set of things that we're working on that will make the OSS integration compelling to us. For instance, what we're doing with like container instance is a good example, right? Where we're saying, let's hide away the complexity where there is this big thing in the cloud. I am a developer. Let me push my bits there. And I want to do it. Some people are comfortable with like serverless, but some people are comfortable with, I want to know the infrastructure, right? I want to understand the infrastructure. We want to handle both ends of the spectrum. And that's why we're investing both in the Terraform side of things and in the sort of more functions and microservices world, right? So that's...
Arun, thank you so much for taking some time. Good luck with your talk today.
Thank you.
Microsoft is a sponsor of our podcasts and live streams from the Open Source Summit in Los Angeles, California. Learn more about app service on Linux and Microsoft's journey as they continue their road to adopting and embracing open source technologies. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcasts. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.